He climbed higher and higher up the mountain path until he accidentally stumbled upon an old bag hidden under some roots. A minute later, he realized he had made a mistake. Look what happened after the discovery. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The mountains had always been a place Damon Brooks associated with clarity, but as he climbed the rough, uneven trail leading toward the high ridge, he realized he had never come here carrying such a heavy heart. The weight of his pack strained his shoulders, yet it felt light compared to the pressure lodged somewhere deep in his chest. The past year had stripped him down to the bones, the unexpected layoff from the tech company he had grown comfortable in, the breakup with Emily, who had once told him he carried silence like a second skin, and the long, soured relationship with his mother, who seemed to blame him for everything she had lost since his father's death. Damon didn't know exactly what he sought by coming into the mountains alone, only that the world below felt too loud, too cramped, too full of unasked questions. Up here, he hoped he might hear something resembling his own voice again. He had chosen a route few hikers attempted, an old Forest Service trail almost forgotten by the maps and practically erased by the terrain. His father had walked with him along these slopes many times when Damon was a boy, pointing out the shape of distant peaks, teaching him how to read a compass, telling him how nature always revealed the truth to those willing to listen long enough. After his father died, Damon had avoided the mountains for years, unable to bear memories heavy with nostalgia and loss. Now, with everything in his life cracking at once, he needed the silence he had once feared. He needed the rawness of the wind, the indifference of the rocks, the isolation that allowed no room for artifice. The forest thickened as he progressed, turning from a scatter of pines into a dense green wall that swallowed the light. Up ahead, the trail narrowed, curving around a slope, broken by jagged stones and slick moss. His boots slipped once or twice, forcing him to steady himself against tree trunks rough enough to scrape skin. The sun, still high above the ridge, filtered through the canopy in narrow beams that seemed almost solid in the dusty air. His breath came harder with each incline, but he welcomed the exhaustion. It kept his mind from wandering into memories he wasn't ready to revisit. The air grew cooler, carrying a faint scent of pine resin and damp earth. A hawk cried somewhere above the treetops, its lonely voice echoing across the valley. Around noon, he stopped briefly to drink, leaning against a boulder smoothed by centuries of wind and rain. He studied his GPS for reassurance, but the device flickered uncertainly before losing signal entirely. Damon frowned and tapped the screen, but nothing changed. The trail ahead didn't match the downloaded route, at least not exactly. He should have seen a marked fork splitting toward the ridge by now, yet there was nothing but fallen branches and shadows. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the landscape, trying to match it to the faint contours of memory from childhood trips. The forest had changed, that was obvious, but something else gnawed at him. A sense of being subtly off course, a feeling that the mountain was shifting under his feet, nudging him toward places where maps had little meaning. He hesitated only a moment before deciding to continue upward. The air felt thicker here, more humid, as though the forest was holding its breath. He glanced at the sky through the swaying needles, noting the first thin strands of fog rolling down from higher elevations. If he didn't move now, he risked being swallowed in the mist with no way to navigate. He adjusted his pack straps and pushed forward, letting instinct guide him. Within half an hour, the terrain shifted sharply. The trail, already faint, dissolved into a tangle of roots and loose soil. It looked as though a recent landslide had chewed away part of the mountainside, leaving behind a raw gouge of displaced earth. Damon climbed carefully, digging his boots into the muddy slope, grabbing onto exposed roots for balance. When he reached the top of the disturbed patch, he stopped, catching his breath. There was no longer any sign of a formal trail, trees pressed close together in every direction, their trunks rising like pillars of an ancient cathedral. The canopy was so thick here that only dim green light reached the forest floor, giving everything a muted, dreamlike quality. He considered turning back, but he knew from experience that retracing steps in unfamiliar terrain could be more dangerous than forging ahead. Besides, something in the air felt different, charged, almost watchful. It was as though the forest had become its own entity, a presence that noticed him. Damon tightened his grip on his trekking pole and stepped into the maze of trees. The ground softened beneath him, carpeted with moss that squished underfoot like a damp sponge. The smell of humus and decaying leaves grew stronger. Broken branches crackled lightly with each step, though the sound didn't travel far. The forest seemed to swallow noise, making even the smallest movement feel strangely intimate. Damon tried to stay mindful of direction, glancing up occasionally at slivers of sky, but the trees twisted sideways and upward in ways that distorted his sense of orientation. It became impossible to tell how far he had come or where exactly he was going. Then something unusual caught his eye. Up ahead, partially obscured by the mass of trunks and branches, a colossal fallen tree lay sprawled across the forest floor. It was unlike any other he had seen, massive, ancient, its bark split open in long, vertical scars. The roots had been torn violently from the earth, leaving behind a crater of disturbed soil. Damon approached slowly, marveling at the sheer size of it. A tree like this could only fall during an extreme storm, the kind that roared across mountaintops with enough force to break what seemed immortal. The roots arched upward like gnarled limbs, twisted and tangled into a shape that resembled a frozen explosion. As he drew closer, Damon noticed something wedged between two thick roots. At first he thought it was a shadow, a dark pocket where the earth had crumbled away. But then he caught a glimmer of something artificial. The shape was too angular to be part of the natural debris. Kneeling down, he brushed aside clumps of wet soil. His fingers encountered the edge of a plastic surface cold, slick, and unmistakably man-made. He worked more urgently now, clearing away mud and broken roots until he could pull free what lay hidden beneath them. Slowly, with a sucking sound, the object emerged. An old, heavy plastic bag, knotted at the top with a frayed cord. The bag was stiff with age, its surface streaked with dirt. Damon felt his pulse quicken. There was no reason for such a thing to be buried here, in the middle of a remote forest. This wasn't a campsite, and there was no sign of human presence for miles. Someone had hidden this deliberately, long before the storm had ripped the tree from the ground. He tugged at the knot, but the cord disintegrated between his fingers. A sour, earthy scent drifted out as he peeled the top open, like time itself exhaled from the bag. Inside, nestled among clumps of soil, were objects that seemed impossibly out of place. The first thing he lifted was a revolver, its metal darkened and pitted with rust, but unmistakably intact. The weight of it in his hand sent a jolt through him, not fear exactly, but something close. He set the gun aside carefully and reached again into the bag. Next, he found a small box of ammunition with tarnished brass casings still inside. Then a knife with a worn wooden handle, the blade's edge serrated from repeated sharpening. Beneath that, stacks of folded papers tied together with string. Damon lifted them gingerly, feeling the brittle texture of the paper through the dirt. The ink on some had run, but others remained legible. The envelopes bore dates long past, some barely visible beneath water stains. Mixed in with the letters were black and white photographs, their edges curled. Damon held one up to the dim light filtering through the trees. It showed a group of men standing in what looked like the same forest, their expressions tense, some wielding rifles. Another photo revealed a car with shattered windows, Another showed a dimly lit gathering of people around a campfire, the glow casting stark shadows across their faces. Damon's stomach tightened. This was no forgotten camping gear. This was evidence of something dangerous, something that had been meant to stay hidden. He reached deeper into the bag and discovered a bundle wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, a dark, brittle stain spread across the fabric. Dried blood. Very old, but still unmistakable. He recoiled, letting the cloth fall back into the bag. His hand brushed against a final object, a small leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, and the first few pages were stuck together, but the writing inside was still readable. The name written on the inside cover made him pause. Randall Mason. Damon turned the pages carefully, scanning the cramped handwriting. The entries began with simple descriptions of daily life in a mountain town decades earlier. Work, family, the changing seasons. But soon the tone shifted. The author wrote of growing tension between local men and the county sheriff's department, of unjust arrests, threats, and acts of violence carried out under the guise of law and order. He described forming a group with other townspeople, armed not out of desire but necessity, they believed, to protect their families. The entries grew darker still. Damon read about ambushes in the woods, meetings in abandoned barns, nights spent expecting a knock on the door that never came. And then he reached a passage that mentioned an officer known for his cruelty. The writing became erratic, the lines shaking with emotion. The officer had disappeared one night after attempting to arrest one of Mason's companions. The journal didn't explicitly state what happened, but the implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. They had fought. Someone had been hurt. Someone hadn't survived. Damon swallowed hard, the enormity of the discovery settling over him. He read on until he reached an entry that chilled him to the core. Mason wrote that he felt followed, that footsteps shadowed him through the woods, that someone wanted to silence him. His last lines were scrawled hastily, the ink smudged. If anyone finds this, the tree has fallen. The truth is no longer mine to keep. Damon sat frozen, the journal lying open across his knees. The forest around him felt suddenly too quiet, as if it had been listening all along. A faint breeze rustled the branches above, but beneath that he heard something else. A soft crunch, like weight shifting on brittle leaves. Damon's breath caught. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone or something was moving through the trees. He snapped the journal shut and turned his head slowly toward the direction of the noise. The undergrowth was thick, veiling whatever might be beyond it. The shadows formed shapes that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Damon strained his ears, heart hammering against his ribs. The footsteps were deliberate, careful, not the frantic scurrying of an animal. Someone was out there. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Damon waited, hardly daring to breathe, but the forest offered nothing more. After nearly a minute, he forced himself to stand, slipping the journal into his pack. His instincts screamed at him to move, to leave this place before the unseen presence drew closer. Yet he found himself rooted in place for a moment, staring at the fallen tree and the gaping hollow where the bag had been hidden. How long had this secret been buried here? And who else might be searching for it? A shiver crawled down his spine. The forest had not felt empty when he arrived, and it certainly didn't feel empty now. Damon backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on the trees, as if expecting one of them to peel open and reveal a watching face. When he finally turned and made his way back to retrieve his gear, his mind churned with a tight, knotted mixture of fear and curiosity. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone, that someone else had been waiting for that tree to fall, for that secret to be exposed. By the time he reached a small clearing to set up his tent for the night, the sky had dimmed into a slate blue. The wind brushed through the branches in soft, eerie sighs. Damon's hands trembled as he drove stakes into the ground, stealing glances over his shoulder every few seconds. The bag's contents lay heavy in his pack, the weight of history and violence settling over him like a second skin. When darkness finally swallowed the forest, Damon sat inside his tent with the journal on his lap, the only source of light the weak glow of his flashlight. Outside, the woods had become a world of shifting shadows and unseen watchers. He opened the journal again, telling himself he needed to understand what he had found, that knowing the truth might give him a measure of control over the fear gnawing at him. Yet even as he read, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The footsteps from earlier echoed in his mind, and every so often he paused, holding his breath, certain he heard movement just beyond the tent walls. The forest listened, the darkness listened, and Damon, caught between past and present, felt the first stirrings of a realization that this night would not pass quietly. Damon barely slept through the night. Every time he managed to drift into a thin, uneasy doze, a rustle outside the tent or the distant creak of shifting branches jolted him awake again. The forest had never felt so alive, or perhaps so aware of him. He kept replaying the footsteps he'd heard before dusk, the deliberate crunch of weight on twigs that no animal could have mimicked so precisely. It wasn't only the sound itself, but the eerie precision of the silence that followed. Whatever or whoever had been out there had known exactly when he was listening. By the time the first pale light filtered through the trees, Damon's nerves were stretched taut, his muscles sore from hours of lying perfectly still and straining to hear anything that might warn him of an imminent threat. When he finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the morning air felt cold enough to sting his lungs. Mist coiled between the trees, like pale smoke, drifting lazily in places and pooling in hollows where the early sun couldn't reach. He shivered, though the cold wasn't the only cause. His mind snapped fully awake as he stepped forward and saw the marks in the soft earth surrounding his campsite. There were impressions, broad, slanted ovals, the unmistakable shape of boot prints. They wandered around the area with a calm deliberation that made his stomach twist. The tracks were not those of a passing hunter or a hiker who stumbled upon him by chance. They circled the tent, paused near the tree line, doubled back toward the fallen giant he'd discovered the day before. Someone had walked here while he slept, moving in a measured, controlled way, as though they wanted to get close enough to observe without revealing themselves. For a long moment he stood motionless, listening to the faint drip of dew from the branches above, trying to convince himself that the tracks could be older, left over from some unknown wanderer long before he had arrived. But the clean edges and damp soil told their own story. These prints belonged to the night, not the past. And more than anything, the spacing of the steps struck him. Whoever had been here was comfortable with the terrain, stepping confidently even in the uneven soft earth. Damon swallowed, feeling the tightness grow in his throat. His mind drifted back to the journal in his pack, the desperate lines penned by Randall Mason, describing the ominous sense of being chased through the woods, the feeling of being shadowed by footsteps that stopped when he did, and returned when he moved. Damon could not stop the shiver that passed through him. The idea that nearly half a century might separate Mason's last moments from Damon's current predicament did nothing to ease the uncanny parallel. Someone had followed the man back then. Someone had forced him into hiding. Someone who didn't want the truth found. The forest might have changed, but perhaps the people tied to that truth hadn't vanished with time. Damon forced himself to pack quickly, his movements stiff with fatigue and nerves. The tent came down in minutes. The journal felt heavy as he slid it deep into his pack, almost as though the stories inside it carried physical weight. After one last look at the boot prints, he shouldered his pack and surveyed the forest in every direction. The morning light was still faint, casting long shadows that stretched between the trees like skeletal fingers. The silence was deceptive. He had the uncanny feeling that the moment he turned his back, the watcher, the one who had circled his tent, might step out from behind a tree. He began to move, telling himself he needed to put distance between himself and the fallen tree. He followed the faintest suggestion of a path, a narrow corridor between ferns and tall roots, stepping cautiously, listening for anything out of place. He had no real plan except to descend the mountain, or at least reach a lower elevation where the trees were not so close and visibility opened up. Every few minutes he glanced back, unable to shake the feeling of eyes on him, even though he saw nothing but mist and green darkness. After nearly an hour of slow, tense hiking, the forest floor began to level out slightly. The oppressive closeness of the trees loosened just enough for him to take deeper breaths. A small patch of sunlight broke through the canopy, warming his face. He paused there, exhausted, leaning one hand against a trunk covered in soft moss. The quiet felt marginally less suffocating, but not comforting. It was the quiet of something waiting. He unslung his pack and sat on a fallen log, pulling out the journal despite his hesitation. He told himself he needed to understand what was inside. Knowledge was a form of preparation, and if the danger he felt was connected to this relic of the past, then reading further might be the only way to make sense of what surrounded him now. He opened the journal to where he had left off. The writing from this section was more frantic, the letters pressed deeper into the paper, as if the pen had been gripped too tightly. Mason detailed the escalating violence in his community, describing break-ins, vandalism, threats delivered under cover of night by men who hid behind their badges. Damon imagined the fear of living under the rule of authorities who punished without reason and escalated retaliation for any form of resistance. Mason spoke of how desperation had forced him and his companions to take matters into their own hands. They carried weapons not with pride, but with dread, knowing what it meant to cross the line between lawful and unlawful, even when they believed they were defending their own humanity. The entries continued, describing a series of confrontations between Mason's group and law enforcement, each more serious than the last. Details emerged about one particular officer, a man whose name Mason never wrote outright, but referred to with chilling consistency. The officer had terrorized the poorer families of the region, especially those living in the outskirts near the tree line. Mason's group believed the officer had committed acts no court would ever hear about, and that his brutality had remained unchecked. Damon's pulse quickened as he read the description of the night when everything changed. According to Mason's account, the group had been moving through the forest to warn one of their families about an impending raid when they were ambushed. The writing described darkness punctuated by muzzle flashes, the sharp sting of bark splintering off trees, the frantic scramble for cover. One moment the officer had been shouting commands. The next, he had fallen, struck by a bullet in the confusion. Mason's words grew heavy in those paragraphs, laden with guilt and resignation. He wrote that they had argued about bringing the man down the mountain for help, but the fear of retribution was too immense. The man they feared had finally become the man they feared to save. The next entries described the frantic hours that followed. Mason and the others had gathered everything that could tie them to the confrontation: the gun, the letters, the photos of their late-night meetings. They hid the evidence beneath the enormous tree, burying it deep in the roots, hoping the forest would swallow it forever. Mason believed the truth was too dangerous to keep above ground, too dangerous to destroy, too dangerous to carry. Damon felt a chill unlike any he had known. He paused, glancing around the forest, as though expecting to see shadows from the past projected into the present. These men had been hunted, feared, and driven into the woods where he now stood. And if the past had left any mark on the land or its people, perhaps those searching for the truth or hiding from it, still walked these same paths. His eyes returned to the journal. Mason's tone shifted in the entries following the burial of the evidence. He wrote of feeling watched. He heard footsteps behind him, sometimes at a distance, sometimes close enough to raise the hairs on his arms. He described the eerie sensation of being trailed by someone who seemed to know the forest even better than he did. The fear in the words was palpable. They seemed to tremble across the page. Mason believed someone knew what the group had done, someone who wanted to ensure that the truth stayed buried at any cost. Damon swallowed hard. This passage echoed his own fear so precisely that he had to put the journal down for a moment. He sat in silence, listening to the forest. The mist had thinned, but the trees still stood like a crowd of silent witnesses. Their branches swayed gently, whispering nothing decipherable. Damon rubbed the tension from his neck, telling himself that paranoia was natural after a sleepless night, and the shock of the discovery. Yet even as he rationalized, his instincts clawed at him with something primal and undeniable. He resumed reading. Mason's final entry sent a shudder through him. The writing was rushed, as though the man had scribbled it while walking. Mason wrote that he no longer believed he could make it out of the forest alive. He spoke of hearing footsteps matching his own, stopping when he stopped, resuming when he moved. He wrote of seeing glimpses of movement between the trees. His last words were barely legible. "If the tree has fallen, then time has done what I could not." As Damon sat alone in that patch of pale sunlight, he could almost feel the presence of the man who had written these words. He wondered if Mason had made it even one more mile before whatever hunted him closed in. He wondered if Mason's family had ever known what became of him. He wondered if the shadow that followed Mason still lingered in these mountains, bound not by time, but by the weight of unfinished business. A sudden snap of a branch broke through the quiet. Damon jerked his head toward the sound, his heart racing. For a moment he saw nothing but shifting leaves. He rose to his feet slowly, every muscle tensed, his breath caught in his chest. Maybe it was an animal, he thought, a deer, a fox, even a bear. Anything would be better than the alternative his mind conjured. He waited. The forest gave no answer. He knew he couldn't stay still. The journal had made one thing clear. Lingering in these woods was how men like Mason disappeared. Damon shoved the notebook back into his pack, slung the straps over his shoulders, and started moving again, this time at a quicker pace. His eyes scanned the undergrowth with each step, searching for movement, searching for signs of another human. His ears attuned to every sound, the rustle of leaves, the flutter of wings, the distant knock of woodpeckers. Every noise felt sharper, every shadow a potential threat. Time stretched. The forest seemed endless, looping back on itself. Damon's legs ached, his breath rasped in the cold air, yet he pushed forward. He was no longer walking to clear his mind or find himself. He was running from something that felt tangled in the roots of the very land around him, something that had watched men before him. As he descended a slight slope, he thought he heard footsteps again, soft, measured, following just far enough behind to remain unseen. He froze and listened. The sound stopped immediately. He felt heat prick the back of his neck, as if eyes were boring into him. The mountains were vast, but right now the world felt claustrophobic, reduced to the space between one tree and the next. He forced himself onward, refusing to look back. Panic would send him stumbling into danger, into a ravine, into a trap. He had to remain focused. He had to reach lower ground. He had to find some form of safety. As he walked, the journal weighed on his back like a pulse. Every so often his mind flashed with images of Mason's group moving through the same woods, their hope and fear etched into the same soil his boots now disturbed. Eventually, the trees thinned just enough to let more sunlight break through. Damon pushed into a small clearing and exhaled shakily. He looked around, scanning the tree line. There was no one. Nothing but the shapes of ancient trunks and the quiet crawl of mist. But when he took a few hesitant steps forward, something caught his eye. A narrow indentation in the earth at the edge of the clearing. A footprint. Not his. And not old. It pointed downward, toward a gentle slope he hadn't yet descended. Damon stared at it, his pulse thundering in his ears. The forest offered no explanation, but he didn't need one. Someone was ahead of him now, and they were waiting. Damon stood over the single footprint for a long moment, staring at the impression as if it were a message carved in stone. The air around him felt thinner than before, as though the mountain itself had drawn a slow breath and now waited for his next move. The clearing was silent save for the faint whisper of wind slipping through the branches above. He had the distinct sense that if he stepped into that footprint, he would be stepping into someone else's story. One that had started decades before he was born and had never been allowed to end. He forced himself to look away from the print and scanned the slope ahead. The trees grew thicker past the clearing, their trunks spaced tightly together, as if guarding the path downward. His instinct told him he should turn and go the opposite direction. But instinct alone wouldn't get him off the mountain. And if someone truly was ahead of him, tracing the route downward was his only chance of reaching help faster. He adjusted his pack, tightened the straps, and started down the incline. The ground was damp and soft, cushioned by fallen needles and rotting leaves. The mist had begun to thicken again, drifting low and pale, curling between his boots. Damon stayed alert, checking every few steps for more traces. It didn't take long. Another footprint appeared near a moss-covered root, then a broken fern, then a shallow indentation where someone had slipped slightly on the slope. The perspective unsettled him, knowing someone moved ahead while another had paced around his tent the night before. How many watchers were here? 1? 2? More? And were they the same person who had taken notice of Mason nearly half a century ago? The questions gnawed at him relentlessly, but he pushed them down. He needed his thoughts clear, not spiraling into panic. Whatever waited ahead would reveal itself soon enough. Or perhaps he would never see it at all, and that was somehow worse. He descended farther, the elevation decreasing just enough that the trees grew wider and taller, their trunks marked with age. Roots twisted across the forest floor like veins under skin, and Damon had to watch every step to avoid catching his foot. The forest felt different here, not lighter, not safer, but older. The weight of time pressed down through the soil and bark, as though memories clung to the land with the same stubborn permanence as the roots. As he walked, the journal inside his pack seemed to pulse against his spine. The knowledge it held felt like a living thing now, a history that refused to remain buried. He wondered what Mason had felt in his final days, whether he too had been consumed with the fear that the past would catch up to him. Damon wasn't part of the events of that era, but now he was entangled in their consequences simply because he stumbled on a fallen tree. Or perhaps, he thought grimly, because the tree wanted to be found. He paused when he reached a narrow rock ledge where water trickled down from somewhere above, forming a thin stream that slithered along the slope. The faint sound of flowing water broke the suffocating quiet, and Damon leaned over to splash cold water on his face. The shock of the temperature grounded him for a moment. He gazed into the trees on the far side of the stream and saw nothing but the stillness of branches. But as he wiped the water from his eyes, a sound drifted through the forest. Not footsteps this time, but a low rustling, like fabric brushing against bark. Damon's breath stalled. The noise was faint yet unmistakable. He crouched instinctively, one hand on the moist earth, staring into the tangle of shadows. The rustling paused, as though whoever had made it realized they had been heard. Damon stayed perfectly still. His heartbeat thudded so loudly he feared it would give him away. He waited. The rustle returned, softer now, as though retreating. Damon slowly rose, unable to see movement but certain he hadn't imagined it. Someone was nearby, close enough to hear, but not close enough to see. A watcher who preferred the cover of distance. He tightened his grip on his pack straps and continued downhill, each step filled with the sense that he was being guided rather than followed. Minutes stretched into an hour. The slope steepened, and Damon had to brace himself against trunks and branches to avoid sliding. The air grew warmer as he descended, and the forest took on the smell of damp earth and old pine. He tried to steel his nerves, but the unease remained a constant shadow. Even when silence returned, it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the silence of someone listening. Eventually, the forest began to open again. The trees grew less dense. The canopy rose higher, allowing more sunlight to filter down in pale ribbons. Damon quickened his pace, eager for the sense of relief that came with wider sightlines. When he stepped into a broad, sloping stretch of forest bathed in golden light, he exhaled deeply, feeling tension loosen from his chest. But the relief was short-lived. As he moved into the sunlight, something near the base of a tree caught his eye. A dark object leaning against the trunk, half hidden by moss. Damon slowed his steps, the prickle of caution returning instantly. He approached carefully, each footfall deliberate. When he came close enough to see it clearly, he froze. A metal sign lay propped against the tree, rusted at the edges, its paint chipped but legible. The emblem was unmistakable, a county sheriff's mark, the kind used decades earlier. Beneath it, the words were barely readable. Search area closed. No unauthorized personnel. The bottom half of the sign was bent inward, as if someone had tried to destroy it. Damon lifted the sign and felt the weight of it. Old, cold, abandoned. This had been left here long before he was born. But why? And more importantly, by whom? Memories from Mason's journal flickered through Damon's mind. Descriptions of officers sweeping the forest, searching for missing members of the group, perhaps even for the officer who had disappeared. Damon imagined the tension of those years, the desperation on both sides, the fear that truth might surface where it wasn't welcome. He set the sign down slowly and turned in a slow circle, inspecting the woods. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. But the silence felt different here, thicker, heavier. This wasn't just any part of the mountain. It was a place authorities once combed through. Perhaps even the very ground they feared held answers. As he scanned the forest floor, his gaze snagged on something else, a cluster of rocks arranged in a way that didn't look natural. Damon knelt beside them, brushing away leaves. Beneath the stones, half buried in dirt, lay a small metal container. His breath caught. It was old, its hinges rusted, but intact. He lifted it gently, brushing soil from its lid. Inside, wrapped in crumbling cloth, was a faded photograph. Damon unfolded it carefully, trying not to tear its fragile edges. The image showed 3 men standing beside a river. One of them was Randall Mason. The other 2 Damon didn't recognize. One tall and lean, the other broader, with a serious expression. But what struck Damon was not the men themselves, but what loomed behind them, a makeshift wooden cross planted in the soil. On the cross hung a strip of fabric that looked familiar in a way that made Damon's stomach twist. The same fabric that had been wrapped around the blood-stained cloth buried beneath the fallen tree decades later. Damon felt the world tilt slightly, as though the past were reaching forward to drag him into its unfinished story. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were the words, He wouldn't let it go. Neither will they. The meaning struck him with a force he hadn't expected. Someone Mason had buried in the woods, perhaps the officer, perhaps someone else, had refused to let the truth disappear. And whoever they were, they still cared enough to stay in these woods, watching for anyone who might stir the ashes of the past. Damon placed the photo back into the container, his hands trembling. The forest felt suddenly less like a wilderness and more like a stage set for something inevitable. He pushed himself to his feet and steadied his breathing. He needed to keep moving, to get off the mountain, to find help. He turned toward the slope and began walking again, but each step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest were swallowing the path behind him. The descent grew steeper. Tree roots rose from the ground like skeletal hands, and Damon swerved around them carefully. He moved faster now, almost jogging, driven by a sense that time was closing in. Every time he slowed, the memory of that rustle in the woods crept back into his mind. He didn't look back anymore. He couldn't bear to see what might be there. When the terrain finally eased again, he found himself near a creek with water rushing over stones. Damon bent to fill his hands with the cool water and drank deeply. The chill soothed his dry throat and cleared his thoughts just enough to remind him he needed to think rationally. As he knelt, he glanced at the far bank and froze. On the other side of the creek, at the base of a tree, another footprint marred the soil. This one was fresh. Too fresh. He felt heat spread across his chest as he realized the truth. The Watcher wasn't behind him anymore. They were ahead. Damon rose slowly, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He scanned the trees above the footprint, searching for any sign of movement. He thought he saw a flicker, a shadow shifting slightly out of place, but when he blinked, it was gone. He whispered to himself, trying to control his breathing. Keep moving. The creek narrowed a little farther down, and he crossed it quickly, stepping from stone to stone. His boot slipped once, splashing water up his leg, but he regained balance and pushed forward. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. The slope continued downward for what felt like another hour. Damon's legs ached, sweat collected along his spine, and his breath grew ragged. His thoughts raced with every step. Maybe the Watcher wasn't trying to harm him. Maybe they were someone who had lived on the mountain for decades, someone tied to the history that had become a ghostly chain binding the land. Or maybe they were someone who saw the journal as a threat, someone who would do anything to prevent the truth from reaching civilization. The possibilities twisted in his mind like roots beneath the soil, but he had no way of knowing. All he could do was follow the slope and hope it led somewhere safe. Eventually, he reached an old forest road, nothing more than a worn path, with grass pushing through the tire tracks, but unmistakably man-made. Damon almost cried with relief. If he followed it long enough, it would lead him down the mountain. He stepped onto the road and began moving with quicker, surer strides. The forest still pressed close on either side, but the path ahead was clear. Damon felt hope kindle, small and fragile like a spark in dry tinder. He imagined reaching the base of the mountain, finding a ranger station, reporting everything he had found. He imagined handing over the journal, the photograph, the evidence of a story that had never been told. He imagined finally escaping the weight of the past. But just as he allowed himself those thoughts, a figure stepped into the path far ahead. Damon stumbled, stopping so abruptly his feet skidded on gravel. The figure stood motionless, half shrouded by shadow beneath the canopy. Neither face nor features were clear. Only the silhouette of a tall man, shoulders squared, watching him in utter silence. For an instant, neither moved. Damon felt the coldness of fear rise up his spine, locking him in place. He couldn't see the man's face, but something in the posture, the stillness, the deliberate way he stood, made Damon's heart slam painfully against his ribs. This wasn't a lost hiker. This wasn't someone who had wandered onto the path by chance. This was someone who had been waiting. Damon took one step backward. The figure didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. He felt his breath shake as he forced himself to stand tall, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. Finally, the figure lifted one hand and pointed not at Damon, but at the pack on his back. The gesture was slow, controlled, unmistakable. They wanted the journal. Damon couldn't breathe. He gripped the straps tighter, feeling the edges of the notebook press into his spine. He didn't know whether the man wanted it to protect the truth or bury it forever. But Damon knew one thing with absolute certainty. Giving up the journal would not save him. He didn't wait for the man to move. Damon turned and bolted into the trees, abandoning the path entirely. Branches whipped at his face, roots snagged his boots. But he didn't stop. He dodged between trunks, leapt over logs, slid down a slope so steep he nearly fell. Behind him, he heard the unmistakable crash of footsteps. Heavy, fast, determined. The Watcher was real. The danger was real. And now Damon was running for his life. The forest blurred around him, a chaotic rush of green and shadow. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He didn't know where he was going. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, keep running, keep breathing. He burst into another clearing, chest heaving, vision spotted with exhaustion. He paused just long enough to listen. The footsteps had grown fainter, farther away. Maybe he'd confused the Watcher, or outrun him for a moment. He staggered toward a fallen log and collapsed to one knee, gasping for air. His hands shook violently as he unslung his pack and tore it open, gripping the journal with both hands. He stared at it as if it might offer an answer, a direction, a way out. Mason had fled through these same woods. Mason had been hunted. Mason had buried the truth beneath a tree that eventually fell. Damon wasn't going to bury anything. He shoved the journal back into the pack, zipped it, and forced himself to stand. He turned toward the deeper slope, searching for any path, any opening, any sign of escape. In the distance, the forest parted just enough for him to glimpse something beyond the trees, a faint line of sky, brighter than the forest canopy. Lower ground. Maybe a service road or a ranger station. Maybe safety. He pushed forward again, every muscle trembling, every breath burning. The trees thinned. The sky widened. The ground angled downward more sharply. Damon stumbled, but didn't stop. At last he burst out of the woods and onto a gravel road that ran along the base of the mountain. Sunlight washed over him, warm and blinding. He staggered forward, nearly collapsing from the sheer relief of open space. He looked behind him. The forest loomed, silent and inscrutable, the shadows swallowing any sign of pursuit. No figure emerged. No footsteps followed. Not yet. Damon closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and felt a tremor of rage mixed with fear. He had survived the mountain. He had the journal. And now he understood exactly why the truth had been buried, because someone had never wanted it to reach the world beyond the trees. He tightened the straps of his pack and began walking down the gravel road toward civilization. The past was no longer hidden in roots and soil. It walked with him now. And whatever waited ahead, Damon knew he would see this through, because the forest had hunted him. But he had made it out, and the truth was coming with him. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, watch the next videos, and explore the others on the channel. Share this video with someone who enjoys these stories.